Afternoon. We're very fortunate to have three experts in quantum computing who understand the industry, national security, and how the implications of each play together. I'm very pleased to introduce Bob Sorensen, Chief Analyst for Quantum Computing at Hyperion Research, where he's currently the High Performance Computing Analyst covering advanced and emerging computing hardware, architectures, benchmarking, and performance analysis. Previously, he was a senior technology analyst supporting senior level U.S. policymakers, including those in the White House, Department of Defense, and Commerce. Chris Larakis, advanced quantum devices scientist at IBM. Chris is a quantum computing ecosystem strategist with expertise in programming, high energy physics, quantum information, superconducting technologies, and electronics design. Chris enjoys leading teams, building disruptive technologies with the potential for significant impact, and is passionate about undergraduate students getting access to quality advanced physics lab where the students can get hands-on experience in developing experiments and learning experimental techniques. Chris is also passionate about reinvigorating the manufacturing space in the U.S. Steve Reinhardt is the Vice President of Product Development at Quantum Computing Incorporated. Throughout a career at Cray Research, SGI, a startup called Yark Data, D-Wave, and now QCI, Steve has focused on maturing new high-performance computing technologies for production use and has created new computing analytic APIs for subject matter experts since 2003. As we begin, I wanted to read this excerpt from the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance released last week by the White House. Where it says the world's leading powers are racing to develop and deploy emerging technologies such as quantum computing that could shape everything from the economic and military balance among states to the future of work. Given that our panel is focused on national security concerns with quantum computing, can we ensure that the U.S. has a technological advantage while ensuring our economy and businesses are viable as the technology matures? I'll let the panelists decide who can take that first.
You're going to let us flip for it?
You have one of those quantum coins or something?
So, I mean, certainly, I think we would all agree that the U.S. is poised to make this happen. And the question is, what do we have to do to enable it to be able to, or to foster all the industries to move forward to create that ecosystem that's necessary to support. And we should not, I know we're focused on quantum computing, but we should really focus on quantum information at large to make sure that the DoD gets all of the things that they need associated with that.
Yeah, I guess my thought would be, I don't know for sure that we can do that, ensure that the U.S. has a technological advantage, but to me, there are obviously things we can do that will make it more likely that we have an advantage, and we should do those things.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. There's no way to guarantee anything, but there are ways to make sure that government policy, commercial desires and competitive aspects, as well as academic progress, all are merged and somehow coordinated in a fashion that leads towards an optimal outcome. I don't think that you can guarantee anything if you just let these three different elements that all can contribute to quantum information science go off on their own direction. There needs to be at least some degree of collaboration and coordination and cooperation between the sectors to optimize the potential output.
Okay. Well, just to kind of follow up on that, what are some of the key factors you think that are going to drive whether or not we can get an advantage?
Maybe I'll jump in. To me, a lot of this is fairly simple and maybe not. I mean, my sister's always said I have a keen grasp for the obvious. And as a country, I think we have to ask for what we want. And I think what we want is quantum computers that are delivering compelling performance. And right now, we're not there yet. So we have to think about how we get there. Research is an indispensable part of getting there, but it's a way it's a step on the way to delivering compelling quantum computers, not an endpoint. And so, to me, we should fund research, yes, but we should explicitly be favoring products when they appear. And there's one current bill in the Congress that only funds research. So if you had a product that was actually useful by the simple reading of the law, you wouldn't be able to buy it with that money. So it seems kind of crazy. We want production computers eventually, so let's ask for what we want.
Steve makes a great point here. I think we need to look at both sides of the equation here. There's a natural inclination for government policy and the investment community, in some cases, to think about the push. What is the technology that we need to develop, and how can we get there? And in some cases, we ignore the pull concept. How can we create a receptive commercial sector, a receptive military, national security infrastructure to make use of what's being produced? And we can't rely entirely on the commercial providers to understand exactly how they can commit to a product development and then make sure that it has applications. We need to be thinking about the ultimate end users of quantum computing to make sure they have a seat at the table. They understand the risks, they understand the challenges, they understand the opportunities, and they can contribute to the policy-making discussion as well to ensure that everyone has a sense of where the supply is coming from and ultimately the value of its end use. You just can't have a, if you build it, he will come mentality in a technology that right now is so speculative, so risky, and doesn't have the kind of roadmap that the IT community is used to dealing with.
Well, there's a couple interesting challenges with this. One is you want to get cost components, and Bob, you brought up a really good point about incorporating the commercial sector. But there's challenges associated with that. Chris, do you have any follow-on thoughts about how we might go about this?
Well, I think that, we're in violent agreement, which is unfortunate. It would be nice to have some objections here.
Okay, we'll get there.
Yeah, we will get there. Let me just riff off of what was just previously said. So there's an aspect, and you said it in kind of your introduction of this, where we need to, and I don't know if this is the government, but the government can play a big hand in this to be able to create the correct ecosystem. And that's it's a combination of both the software and the hardware ecosystem that's robust enough to take us where we are today. And I agree with what's been said before. We're kind of in this still very nascent field. There is no killer app yet. There's nothing that's developing the pull. There's a promise of pull. And I think that what we want to do is make sure that when we get to that point where the pull actually exists, or we should actively engage with the Department of Defense to find out what applications they think are most important, and then how we might provide the appropriate enabling technologies to make that a reality, and then help, as you say, Bob mentioned the roadmap. There's got to be a roadmap that's developed in that, and then also a tolerance for, well, it's not a straight line. We're going to get there through a whole variety of, well, that was a bad idea. Okay.
Well, that sort of leads me to the next question, which are, and by the way, as we're going, audience members, please feel free to submit questions. I know there's going to be quite a bit of conversation here today. But I wanted to ask, what are some of the lessons we've learned from classical computing and other technologies that have gone through the technology life cycle, as we're very early on with this technology?
I'll jump in here initially, and the thing I'll point out is, in the IT sector in the early days, it was definitely a government-funded, military-centric kind of research agenda, and a lot of the technology that ultimately became commercially successful had its genesis in military research or national security infrastructure. I don't see that being the case in quantum. I think here we're looking more of an environment where national defense is a critical end user, but I don't see it as the significant driver of the technology. In fact, I don't even know if government is a significant driver of the technology. I think from a policy planning perspective, there needs to be an understanding that that the commercial sector, in some sense, will be a significant technology driver and one of the more significant end users in the near term. And so the national security agenda needs to understand that they are no longer the dog or the tail. I don't know which aspect of who wags who in this particular example, but it's not like we saw in the early days where the government had the ultimate say in technology development because they were the significant and most wealthy consumer. That's not going to be the case in quantum. So it's going to require a different set of enticements and inducements by the government to make sure that their national security requirements are met, writ large, a much more commercially attractive, client base out in the customer world.
So I want to really emphasize what Bob just said, because I think that's really very important, and is that it is very different today. I'm obviously going to speak from a very IBM-centric point of view, but the drive really is coming more from the commercial sector. And so, God, for the last 20 years, the DoD has been relying more and more on commercial off-the-shelf type of solutions. So let's kind of work with that. Let's create that, and then create the specialty machines that are required for the Department of Defense or other consumers. That's going to be a much bigger winning factor when you think about it, because then you're going to have a much better lifetime in terms in a development cycle for keeping the DoD up to date.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with what was just said by both Bob and Chris. I would maybe add a particular slant to it. I've had experience. There are parts of the U.S. government that have been very effective, in my view, working with specific vendors to add specific capabilities to existing commercial products, as Bob and Chris were saying, that would that those particular agencies know how to take advantage of. An example of that I think of is in the DEC Alpha processor, which is at one point, the fastest microprocessor you could buy. The U.S. government funded inclusion of the pop count instructions, which was really useful for particular types of processing. It was available to everybody. It went into the standard product. Not everybody really looked at it or knew how to use it. So I think, to me, that can be very, very useful. And I guess I would kind of couple that with, I think the way the U.S. government is going to be able to gain the benefit from quantum computers the way we want and need, is by understanding those quantum computers at least as well as anybody else. And in my opinion is that, as everyone has said, these machines are very new. The knowledge is incomplete. It'll be really important that people from the particular agencies will have not only intellectual understanding, but visceral understanding of what the systems do and what they don't, and how to use them effectively. And it is almost impossible to overstate how much you learn by using early systems, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, understanding how you can possibly get past the weaknesses. And that is a really rich conversation you can have, but it's strongly dependent on the level of understanding of the end users.
Mm-hmm.
I
was just gonna say, Mike, one other thing I'd add, and it's more holistic, but I think something we need to keep in mind is, U.S. policy and the way that the commercial sector has conducted itself, and end users, and even some of our government rules and regulations have been premised that the IT sector is the United States has functionally held an unassailable lead in both technology development and legacy capabilities. And that gave us, the United States, an awful lot of free ride activities. And you could think about something as simple as export controls in that field. Quantum is a clean slate. There's no clear leader now. There is no legacy boost. There's nothing that really comes from IT capability that translates directly into quantum capability. And we've seen that and I always say, certain countries punching above their weight in quantum as opposed to their capabilities in traditional IT. In a place like, say, Canada or Australia would be great examples. So what we have to keep in mind here, and anytime we talk about any kind of policy or activities within the sector, is that this is a global phenomena where we are not the unassailable leaders. Our supremacy is not assured. And I always like to say, we have to be cautious, because it's not like the old days where if the U.S. government didn't fund it, it didn't get done. Now we can say if the U.S. government doesn't fund it, somebody else is probably going to do it anyway. And so we need to look at this from a much more global context. And what happens if we isolate ourselves from the rest of the world, some of the problems there, versus the need to think about national security from a global perspective. How can we navigate this when we're not the unassailable leaders in this technology?
But we should also, I think that's a really good point. We should think about how do we take advantage of that global interest? How do you bring these people in and make them your allies rather than your adversaries? Now, there's always going to be clear adversaries, but we really have to take advantage of that, because you're right that we do not have the unassailable lead, as you say.
I was just when I did some dabbling in the export control area a while back, and the question always became in terms of, okay, what do we gain by denying technology or denying capability, making it difficult for foreign nationals to work on government-funded research programs and such. But no one ever did the analysis about what do we lose by enacting those policies. And I think at a minimum, and the stakes are going to be much higher in the quantum realm, where if we follow the same old kind of policies driven by the national security agenda, we have to at least start to try to quantify what the impact is on the downside, as well as the protection aspect that comes into it. So I think that's just a gentle reminder here about how we need to transform some of the old thinking with respect to how quantum presents new challenges.
Let me build on that for a minute, Bob, because I think that's a really important point also. So let's, there are examples throughout history where controls were placed on them, and then the only end user or the end buyer would be the military. And then it becomes economically unfeasible for U.S. companies to actually manufacture what is needed, because they don't have a global market. So it's going to be a very delicate balance where we play this game. And I'm with you that we should not, kind of shut this down.
Yeah.
Very good.
So Mike, coming back to your question about, lessons from classical computing. Actually, so full disclosure, I work for a quantum software company. So you might think that I have opinions that are perhaps self-serving. But with that said, to me, there's a pair of lessons that we need to both remember and forget, and namely about how we develop high-value software. In the bad old days of computing, each computer vendor had its own stack, top to bottom, instruction set, sometimes even type of memory, bit, word size, etc., operating system, compilers, languages, database system, etc. And people know, it's well known that they used that to lock in users, customers. That was a bad thing. And then users kind of gained control, and over time, Unix was a part of that. That was a common operating system, still not open source, but then we actually moved beyond that to open source. And now, for many parts, especially civilian parts of the US government, if they essentially don't want to pay for software, period. And so if you have value-added software, it's like you don't exist to them. And to me, that pendulum has swung too far. And yes, we absolutely need to make sure that software is done in a way that allows me as a user to move my program from one platform to another. In this case, maybe one quantum processor to another quantum processor. But to say that we know that all innovation will happen in open source means, A, that if anybody at a company has a greater idea, they can't really monetize that. That's to a first order, that's not what we believe in a capitalist society. And the second thing it means is that to the extent we have innovations, we open source them so everybody gets them, even our adversaries. So to me, there's some, we swung too far. We need to swing back a little bit. Exactly what does that look like? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've in a couple of former lives, talking with U.S. government people who believe strongly in open source. I use the argument that, okay, well, maybe we should think about software having a half-life, a decay rate, the value of software having a decay rate. And so maybe a government could buy software, but would say, your value is decaying. And so we're going to ask you to think about how are you going to put 40% of this into open source in the next 2 years, or whatever the fraction is. I'm waving my hands a little bit here. You see that. But there have to be, in my opinion, there are other models we might want to try.
That's a really good follow up there, and I want to make sure we get to our next question because I think it has a lot of really good points. So, what in your experience have you learned about developing the workforce that will be needed to tackle the complex challenges we'll be facing?
I'll jump in. I have been very optimistic about workforce development in the QC sector, simply because, Mike pointed out the stack is coalescing much faster than I anticipated. The idea that you don't have to be a PhD physicist to write code for a quantum computer nowadays. You can, there's application programmer interfaces, there are software development tools. It's interesting, if you look at the career tab on a lot of software companies in quantum and see the kind of people they're interested in, they're looking for folks with software development capabilities, with DevOps kinds of stuff. It's not that they're looking for quantum computing folks. And, my example that I always use is, I would never ask a Python programmer how a metal oxide semiconductor gate works. So why would I assume that I need a quantum physicist to write good code? And so really what's happening is, because of the abstraction within the abstraction implementation stack, you could be a software developer and not know about quantum. You could probably start to think about compiler writing and not have to know too much about what's above you or below you in the stack. And so to me, that does a great gift in terms of mitigating the requirements for workforce development. And the other thing, of course, is, and Steve, I always say you're a stellar example. You're a quantum guy right now. You weren't a quantum guy a decade ago. There are a whole bunch of people out there, smart people, who have programming skills and insights that they can bring as a toolkit to a new sector and hit the ground running. So we shouldn't just concentrate on workforce development in terms of graduates coming out of school. We should think about retraining and basically the itinerant programmer, the itinerant software engineer, the folks who can bring their skill set to a new technology and use it in a new and interesting way. So I'm much more optimistic about the workforce development issue than I was perhaps even, say, 3 years ago.
So I want to make sure that we don't leave out, because you guys are being very software centric, and I'm a dyed-in-the-wool hardware guy. That there, look, exactly. I think part of that is that we have to make sure that people understand that, to your point, you do not need to be a quantum physicist to contribute to making a quantum hardware portion of a quantum computer. You need to learn what I'd call an armchair knowledge of what quantum computing is. And there is a need for mechanical engineers and electrical engineers. I think that, if you were in Zyra's talk when she was doing the fireside with Mike Hayduk, she talked about that, and I think also Mike brought this up, that the classical computers will never be displaced. There's always going to be classical computers that are going to be the front end to these quantum computers. And one of the bigger problems, and this is not just a software problem, but it's a hardware problem, how do you make the two of those work seamlessly together? How do you change that workload? How do you make it, to Bob's point, you've got to make it totally transparent, so that this is now available to every person. You're not have specialized training to build out that appropriate workforce.
IBM has a computer just like that on the cloud that's accessible today. Isn't that right?
Yes.
All right. Well, that's excellent. We do have time to take one question from the audience. And by the way, those were great answers. And I think you basically answered the question: how hard is it to get the workforce plugged into the space? Not not very hard as it requires a broad set of skills. The question I have is from Rebecca Sexton, and she's asking, what methods and approaches are you using to represent the end user in the process? So the people that are going to use these quantum computers.
So maybe I'll jump in. So, and just to be clear, we have a quantum ready software product in the market today. You can solve problems classically. You can also solve problems using a quantum processor directly. And so we have some members of our team who are application developers, not system software developers or tool developers or compiler developers. So they are, we refer to one of them as user zero. And we also have end users that are physicists. We call them subject matter experts or SMEs. They're, protein designers or logistics people or schedulers or whatever their expertise is. And they use our software and they say, boy, I'm trying to do this and I just can't find a way to do it. What are you guys thinking? Or, oh, that's how you use that. Okay, I need that. Good. Thanks for telling me that. And we get feedback, and we're trying to meet them where they are, using concepts that they already know and understand. But to me, that's you just have to get that immediate feedback absolutely as early in the life cycle as you can.
I'll be very quick. The beauty of quantum is that the barriers to entry are so low for anyone within the corporate world. The old days, if you wanted to dip your toe in HPC, you were writing a $25 million check to Cray. You had to replumb the basement with water and all. Expensive staff. Nowadays, you go on the cloud access model. Any corporation that wants to commit a couple of smart grad students to dipping their toe in the water can do it. It's a matter of widespread availability and low barriers to entry. And Chris, I'm gonna throw it to you and say, talk about all the partnerships that IBM has with end users.
That's what I really wanted to bring up, because I think this is a really key thing. There's huge number of partnerships. I probably can't say a dollar figure, but we're talking more than 100 partnerships with various companies at this point. But if I want to focus on like DoD specific, one of the things, and this is part of one of my assigned missions by my boss, is to reach out to DoD entities. Now that's DoD contractors and the DoD proper, and work with them. We're not the domain experts. We're not the subject matter experts, as you pointed out, Steve, in the Department of Defense actual application. But what this group here, can do is provide the ability to enable that, the enabling technology, the enabling software. We have the understanding, and we can work with them and say, wait a minute, to your point, if you think about your problem slightly differently, you can implement it on this fabric and you will get quantum advantage. And that's something that, we're not there yet, I don't think. We need to get like a consortium or something like that, where more people come to the table and we talk about the end user problems. And then we, as our, this group that we've gathered here, that Mike, you've gathered, come up with the enabling technology, the enabling software that makes it easy, keeps the barrier to entry very low.